There is a handout, and I apologize for the inordinate amount of Greek text on it. The truth is you will be able, I hope, really to follow what I'm saying just by listening to my paper. And I just thought there might be one or the other who wanted to check whether what I say is really backed up by the original text. And so if that's your intention, feel free to do so. If not, I don't think and I won't hope that you miss out on a lot by if you just follow what I'm saying. The other thing I have to say is that even though the title that has been just been given for my lecture is almost the one that I'm going to speak about, I have to make one very small change, but well, it's small in terms of the number of words. It's not quite so small in some other ways. As a matter of fact, I speak about the redemption of human nature. I'm not going to say anything about the fall. So the subtitle is just the redemption of human nature in Gregory's commentary on the Song of Songs. Now, the fact that Gregory was quite fond of the old Pauline metaphor of the first fruits and the lump of dough is fairly well known. And I'm not going to reiterate here what scholars over the years have said about it. For that reason, the object of my talk is much more specific. It really is just about the use Gregory makes of that terminological and conceptual pair in his homilies on the Canticum. In a way, therefore, I'm using what you might find is a rather pedestrian approach. I really look carefully, hopefully carefully, in detail at a number of texts, and as you'll find, it's a relatively small number of texts where Gregory is using these terms in his commentary on the Song of Songs. And I used that, you might say almost as a canary in a coal mine method by asking myself, if we can understand how he's using it in this particular context, perhaps that helps us understand something more general about Gregory's theological ideas and perhaps specific theological ideas in this very late writing of his. I start with a few comments on the background history. The passage, of course, in Paul is in Romans 11:6. If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. A soteriological application of that verse, largely without discussing the context in Paul or indeed its background in the sacrificial law of the Old Testament, occurs already in the 2nd century. The first people we know to have done so are the Valentinians. The Valentinians, as Irenaeus tells us, that's the first quote on your handout, taught or said, the Savior received first fruits of those whom he was to save. Paul declared when he said, and if the first fruits be holy, the lump is also holy, teaching that the expression first fruits denoted that which is spiritual, but that the lump meant us. You can see slightly indignant Irenaeus. The psychic church, the lump of which they say he assumed and blended it with himself inasmuch as he is the leaven. So the Gnostics thought the first fruits were the pneumatics and the lump of dough were the psychics who could participate in salvation in a kind of secondary way. And as you can gather from the quotation I just read to you, Irenaeus isn't particularly impressed by that exegesis. Another person who wasn't particularly impressed by that exegesis was Origen. Origen deals in some detail with the Pauline verse in his really rather great commentary on the Epistle to the Romans, which we only have in a Latin translation. In his a commentary specifically on this verse, he starts by acknowledging that the Valentinians and some other Gnostics want to read this verse as confirming their idea about different classes in humanity, but Origen rejects that. He says there aren't several classes of human beings. Instead, and that's the quotation under number 2 on your handout, there is one nature for all men, or rather for all rational beings, and it is suited equally for salvation, and if it becomes negligent, for perdition. And a little bit later in the same commentary, he says, all who are saved, that's still the same passage, but just a bit further down, all who are saved are engrafted into this root, and from this holy first portion, the entire lump of the human race is sanctified. Well, we'll see in a moment that Gregory of Nyssa's own reading of the first fruits and the lump follows fairly closely in the footsteps of what Origen prepared. He used the term, or the references to Pherama and Aparche, or Aparche and Pherama occur more than 20 times in Gregory's writings. I suspect that perhaps one reason why he was fond of the pair was its relative flexibility. As such, the reference to the first fruits and the dough didn't necessarily commit Gregory to a very precise soteriological theory, and actually if we did look over the entire spread of this terminological pair across Gregory's writings, then we'd find that on one extreme, Gregory uses it in a fairly synergistic context where the emphasis really is on individual participation in the salvific process. And on the other extreme, and these are the passages that have been mostly discussed in the Contra Eunomium and the Adversus Apollinarium, he seems to suggest a process that is almost mechanical, where the salvific action is almost entirely just focused on Jesus Christ, and from that a beginning spreads almost automatically to the rest of humankind. So what's Gregory doing in the homilies on the Song of Songs with this terminological pair? So I propose starting my investigation from a passage in Gregory's 13th homily. The text he wrestles with there is what biblical scholars now call the Colloquium of Friends and Bride, a text in which the female lover is asked to explain how and why her beloved is different from and better than other men. Well, for Gregory, of course, the subject speaking here is the human soul, and the object of her discourse is Christ himself. The question, therefore, for him is how what is unknowable, agno umenon, about God becomes visible in Christ to her who perceives truth with the eye of the soul. To this question, Gregory replies in the first instance. That's already now the text number 3 on your handout. So his reply in the first instance is that the teacher, Heredidaskalos, thinks of Christ's humanity, his created part, because in and through the latter, the uncreated and indivisible nature of the deity can to some extent be grasped. This, Gregory continues, is, as he says, the great mystery of our religion. Mysterion tes Eusebeas. God became revealed in the flesh. He who was in divine form turned towards men in the role of a slave. In the unique historical act of the incarnation, hapax, he took on the frail nature of the flesh through, and here we have it, its first fruits. Continually, he sanctifies the whole lump of the nature together with the first fruits. By means of those who unite themselves with him, he nurtures his own body, the church, whose members are increasingly integrated into him as limbs of this very body, eyes, mouth, and hands. Well, you've heard references to this text today and yesterday before. My first observation on this is that Gregory, in the present place, describes the goal of incarnation and more broadly redemption in the terminology of cognition and knowledge. In Christ, the eternal becomes visible and perceptible in the flesh. Nature, we might say, becomes transparent for the divine. Matter lets us perceive spirit. The created gives a glimpse of the uncreated. This surely is not an ad hoc argument, but harks back to some of Gregory's most powerful earlier work. In the De Anima et Resurrectione, he had, through the mouth of his sister Macrina, presented the argument that much as the world displays the wisdom and power of its maker, the human body allows us to infer the existence of the intelligible soul. It's a really analogical argument, and given this parallel, I think it's actually really interesting that Gregory, without being provoked to it by the text, refers to the female speaker as Herr Didaskalos, right? Is it Macrina? Is it Diotima? It's quite evocative there, I think. In fact, this approach is characteristic of Gregory's understanding of physis nature as a reality that is perceived by the senses in the first instance, but then reveals deeper and more unified strata of being to those who know how to perceive properly. Unlike Plotinus or Augustine, well, I at least think that, Gregory usually does not privilege introspection, but the careful observation of the visible world around him. This, incidentally, is borne out by his many digressions about anatomical, astronomical, and generally scientific questions. Gregory evidently experienced the world through the visual perception of its empirical reality, and in and through that reality, not by turning away from it, he sought to progress towards the intelligible and divine nature as the true center and source of its being. As a matter of fact, and perhaps this is the right place to say it, I think that Gregory is much closer to Thomas Aquinas in some ways than people often realize. If human nature, therefore, is said to be created in God's image, this for Gregory, again, means that it is the privileged gateway for this kind of perception. Seeing human persons endowed with mind and goodness, we can and ought to see God analogically in his intelligible and spiritual being and as the perfect goodness. And if the image is now darkened and disfigured as the consequence of human sin, this means that conversely it has become more difficult to see through their sensible appearance and perceive in and through them something of God's own beauty and goodness. The economy of salvation, consequently, is the process by means of which this damage is undone. This, it seems, is what Gregory is saying in the present passage. Christ is the first fruits insofar as his humanity, the created aspect of his person, uniquely permits us a glimpse of the divine according to John 1:14, and we saw his glory. Not the word became flesh. That's actually not a favorite of Gregory's, but we saw his glory. That's the biblical phrase he has in mind here, or cites here. The appearance of God in the flesh sets off the restoration of God's creation by establishing a human being whose created reality displays, as far as possible, the characteristics of the uncreated deity. Behind this seeming simplicity, there lurks, of course, a much more complicated issue. It is evident, and Gregory is fully aware of it, that for human beings to fulfill their potential of making God visible on earth requires their active volitional collaboration. Otherwise, the fall into sinfulness would never have been possible in the first place. Redemption then must involve both divine and human agency. It is more than a pedagogical program for the moral improvement of humankind, but it is not achieved by divine fiat either. Gregory does not, in the present place, explain what this means for Christology, but it is more explicit, at least a little, about the subsequent progression of salvation history in and through the Church. So the question then is, how does he strike the balance between the two? Well, it is this very link that he hopes to elucidate with the formula of first fruits and the whole dough. So on the one hand, Gregory emphasizes divine agency. God drew frail human nature to himself in the unique act of the incarnation. He continues, always to co-sanctify the whole dough of human nature. He nurtures his body, the church. At the same time, Gregory makes it clear that this process involves the active collaboration of those who, and I quote, unite themselves with God through participation in the mystery. Is he thinking about the Eucharist? I don't know. And while he describes human membership in the church in rather passive terms, being grafted as members onto the common body, he mentions their faith as a prerequisite for this process. Further down in the text of the same homily, Gregory returns to the same topic and enlarges on the consequences of the co-sanctification for the whole lump. This is now passage 4 on your handout. All the words that describe the bridegroom's beauty are not indicative of the invisible and inconceivable nature of the deity. We know that already, but of that which was revealed in the salvific dispensation when he, God, or the Logos, was seen on earth and lived among human beings, having been clothed in human nature. In this way, according to the apostle, his invisible reality is seen through his works. It is revealed through his creation of the ecclesiastical world, for the formation of the church is the creation of a world in which, according to the prophet's voice, the heaven is created anew, which, as Paul says, is the firmament of faith in Christ, and a new earth is created which drinks the rain that falls upon it, and a new human being is formed, renewed from above, according to the image of him who created him. It's really quite extraordinary that Gregory here uses Romans 1:20, the locus classicus of natural theology, to describe the way God becomes visible through the humanity of Jesus Christ. It's really interesting. Anyway, I mainly want to focus on a slightly different aspect of what he's saying here. Throughout his works, Gregory makes use of the Pauline terminology of salvation as a new creation. There's obviously 2 Corinthians 5:17, but there are not many passages in which the analogy is drawn and developed in such detail. The reason Gregory does it here, church as a new creation, the reason Gregory does it here becomes evident a little later when he explicitly asserts that the church as a new cosmos permits the perception of God, of him who is all in all. He who observes the visible world and notes the wisdom showing itself in the beauty of the things that exist draws an analogy from the beauty of what is seen to the invisible beauty and the source of all wisdom, whose emanation brought the nature of those things into existence. In the same way, he looks at this new world created as the church, perceives in it him who is all in all, and who became a thing conceivable and perceptible by our own nature in order to lead us to knowledge of the inconceivable. So for the moment, the picture emerging from our analysis is something like this. Christ's humanity is the primary means permitting us the perception of divine nature within the confines of the created order. That is, in a way, our nature can actually grasp it. Subsequently, the same function is increasingly fulfilled through the church, which is his body. This new creation, by means of the various charismas present in it, in its turn becomes a reality that makes the created order transparent for its divine creator. It has to be admitted, I think, that in this account, in spite of Gregory's occasional emphasis on human participation, salvific agency is primarily ascribed to God. God is and remains the author and the subject of the salvific dispensation. He reveals himself in human form in the incarnation. He plants and nurtures his body, the church. He integrates people into this unit as members. In particular, and I think really quite strikingly, Gregory is happy to draw on the analogy between the creation of the natural world and the new creation of the church without feeling the need to dwell on any major dissimilarity between the two. In the text I have so far analyzed, then, we learn quite a few things about Gregory's conception of the incarnation and salvation. You may perhaps ask whether I haven't to some extent strayed from my topic, because what I haven't really explained, or haven't done a lot to explain, is how exactly he understands the idea of the first fruits and the dough. But I think there's a reason for that, and the reason is that even though Gregory alludes to the first fruits and the lump of dough in this passage, he actually doesn't help us or doesn't give us many indications of how exactly he understands their relationship. What precisely is the relationship between Christ's human nature and the subsequently sanctified humanity of those who are embraced by his body, the church? In what sense does the solidarity between the first fruits and the dough contribute to the salvific process? Gregory, in the passages I've so far looked at, hasn't been explicit about these questions or hasn't explicitly addressed these questions. Instead, a little further down, he introduces yet another metaphor, and once again it is biblical in origin. The context is his exegesis of Canticum 5:11, where the beauty of the beloved is described by comparing his head to Kephas gold. Gregory, struggling as usual with the Greek of the Septuagint, surmises that the original meaning is pure gold, but what does this signify? Well, Gregory suggests that the emphasis is on purity, on the absence of mixture with sullying matter, which, according to him, points once again to Christ. And again, but not according to the eternity of his divinity, but according to the man who was the vessel of deity. In this sense, he observes Paul called Christ the head of his body, the church. That's Colossians 1:18, of course. So Gregory writes, the pure gold then, which is free from admixture with and susceptibility of evil, is the head of the body, the church, and the first fruits of the whole nature. The metaphor of first fruits and dough is thus explained with the help of yet another metaphor, Christ as the head of the body, which is the church. Gregory here does not give any further indication of how either of these two nations should be understood, and I suspect it would not be wise to bring in at this point more philosophical theories he proffers elsewhere. So much in any case seems clear. The relationship he has in mind is one of organic or quasi-organic continuity. It is an asymmetric relationship in which the source or point of origin communicates its properties to those parts that are connected with it. They depend on this source, and while they truly share in its properties, they will not display them in the same purity. Neither one nor the other of the two metaphors, however, provides for a straightforward answer to the question of what kind the relationship in the case of Christ and his church is. Gregory's reference to Christ's ethical perfection in the present place, Kephas gold, pure gold, and the mention of his sinlessness and truthfulness might suggest a spiritual link in which Christians emulate the virtuous life of Jesus. On the other hand, we have observed earlier Gregory's strong emphasis on divine agency throughout the whole process and his insistence that the church is God's new or second creation. Quite how these two elements come together, Gregory does not say, and the metaphors he employs do not necessarily help clarify his meaning in the present instance. I move on to my second major text, which comes at the very end of the 14th homily. So this is now number 7. Song of Songs 5:16 in the Septuagint version uses the Greek term plesion, neighbor, and this inspires Gregory to an allegorical interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The robbed man is humanity, descended from an exalted place because he goes down to Jerusalem, falls among the thieves, he's robbed of its or humanity is robbed of its imperishable gown and left half dead, hemithanē, which according to Gregory means that, and I quote, death advanced to the middle of our nature as the soul remained immortal. I note merely as an aside, a kind of anti-sacrificial swipe in Gregory's comment that priest and Levite signify the useless law as, I quote, the blood of bulls and goats cannot absolve sin. It's really interesting, but it's really just an aside. The Samaritan, of course, is Christ, more precisely the Logos, and I quote, who clothed himself in the whole human nature by means of the first fruits of the dough. In this nature, every nation has its part, Jews Samaritans, Greeks, and overall all people. Gregory then goes on to explain the remaining details of the parable. The Samaritan's animal is Christ's body, the inn is his love of humankind, the 2 coins signify the love of God and neighbor, so nothing remains unexplained. At first sight, Gregory's use of the pair first fruits and lump of dough in this passage is almost identical with the instances I have analyzed before. In fact, the similarities go straight to the wording with which Gregory describes Christ's assumption of human nature in the Incarnation. And yet, there are a number of interesting differences, or at least nuances, that it may be worthwhile paying attention to. Most interestingly, perhaps, is the contrast between his earlier application of the lump of dough to the church as compared with his present mention of all humanity. One certainly should not draw too sharp a distinction. After all, Gregory in one of the earlier passages also spoke of, I quote, the dou phorama of the common nature. And when he spoke of Christ as the head of the body, the church, he then says the first fruits of our whole nature. And yet it is evident, I think, nonetheless, that Gregory's intention in the previous passages from Homily 13 was to move on from Christ's transformation of human nature to its continuation in the church and the community of all those, as he said, united themselves to him. The church was the new creation, which, derived from Christ's perfect humanity, displays the properties of human godlikeness and permits the perception of its creator as far as possible. From the context, it appeared that the reference to first fruits and the whole lump of dough was meant to be read in precisely this way as well. In his exegesis of the parable of the Good Samaritan, by contrast, Gregory shows less concern for those who specifically join his body. Instead, he focuses on the totality of humankind, symbolized by the robbed man. Human nature explicitly is the entirety of the human race. Gregory mentions the various nations that partake of it. We might say the mythical nature of his account compels him to this logic. All humanity is a single, voiceless individual whose lot can only be improved by the application of condescending, agapeic care of which it is the passive recipient. Of course, if for a moment we now think of the wider context of Gregory's works, it's impossible not to be reminded of his exegesis of the parable of the lost sheep, which is much more famous and which he likes to use in the Contra Eunomium and against Apollinaris, and where, of course, the application of the sheep to human nature, which the shepherd puts on his shoulder, and that symbolizes the incarnation and therefore the connection of all human nature with the deity, at least potentially, is something that Gregory makes use of several times. So somehow there seems to be a kind of intellectual connection between these two instances. Anyway, once we look more closely at this present text, things, however, become, if anything, even more complicated. For the truth is that Gregory struggles against these implications. In fact, the extent of his struggle can be measured by, if I may say so, the implausibility of his exegetical assumptions. The inn, he suggests, is Christ's philanthropy. Once a person enters into this place, Gregory says, Christ too will enter into them. Why? I mean, it's not in the story, really. Later, he claims that the coins left with the innkeeper for the care of the robbed man somehow imply that the latter too will be judged at the second coming of Christ on the basis of his fulfillment of the double command to love. Perhaps I'm overly harsh, but I must admit that I find both suggestions really bizarre from an exegetical point of view. The gospel text just does not mention any activity on the part of the robbed man, and I personally, at least, think that that's actually a big problem with the text and the fact that we have it in the gospel. That there is the presentation of the object of salvation as somebody who is not at all an active participant in it. But that's by the by. So I think there is Gregory can't be blamed. I think he's reading the text correctly when he sees it as a sort of total contrast of activity and passivity. We can see that he's worried by that, and so he brings in things that frankly aren't in the text in order to make things a little better. So if I'm right in sensing that there's some uneasiness here on Gregory's part, it would indicate some second thoughts Gregory may have had about some of the language perhaps he used in his controversies with Eunomius and Apollinarius, where of course he was quite happy to draw on this line of reasoning. Yet this is not all. Somehow Gregory's decision to build into his argument the need for human fulfillment of the law as a correction against the tendency to demote humanity to an almost inanimate object also jars, I think, with his account of redemption in the earlier homily 13, which, as we have seen, maintained a focus on divine agency throughout. It almost seems as if Gregory's exposition of the history of salvation through the parable of the Good Samaritan pushes or draws him into two opposite directions. On the one hand, reconstructing redemption as a process in which humanity participates as a purely passive object. On the other hand, by stressing more strongly the need for human synergism in the redemptive process. I'm coming to the end. In order to gain the right perspective for an assessment of these two accounts Gregory gives of human redemption, it may be useful at this point to recall very briefly Gregory's overall purpose in these homilies. Of course, other people have spoken very eloquently about this, so I can be very brief. The purpose is to account for human spiritual perfection. As Gregory explained, the Song of Songs was written for those already progressing on the road towards purification. He seeks to elucidate the details of this human journey towards God. He is therefore inevitably concerned with human development in all its ambiguity, the need to be motivated, the tendency to slacken or even falter, the risk of being distracted, and so forth. It is then significant, I think, it is significant that in this very context, Gregory's account of redemption is so strongly, well, I might say, theocentric. It is significant because one might easily have suspected that the ascetic context would have tempted Gregory to emphasize the human aspect of salvific history. Yet, if anything, he appears to do the exact opposite. He stresses divine agency in this process. This could be observed, I think, in all the texts that I've looked at, albeit in various ways. It can be confirmed in the most striking way by a quick glance at a famous text towards the end of the entire commentary. I should say that initially I really wanted to dwell a bit more on this text at the end of the 15th homily, but then I thought, well, everybody's going to speak on it because it's so incredible, and by the time it's my turn to give my lecture, people will be bored. But as a matter of fact, nobody has so far. So I might have made that comment a bit more, or might have expanded it a little bit. Anyway, in this passage, as I said, right at the end of his whole series of homilies, Gregory illustrates the different degrees of perfection by speaking of redemption as a second creation, echoing his earlier language of the church as the new creation. Some people have thought that this language of first and second creation there is similar to what he says in the De Opificio Hominis, but I think it's totally evident, and especially when one goes back to the 13th homily, that the second creation is the redemptive process, is the new creation as part of salvation history. This whole passage still produces enormous difficulties because Gregory claims that the original creation happened without diastema. He should have read Scott Douglas's book, then it wouldn't have happened. But I'm not going to go into that either. My point is a different one. Describing this second creation, in other words, the redemptive process, Gregory uses the terminology otherwise known from his cosmology. And that's the reason why sometimes people thought it's a sort of second creation. But anyway, he uses this terminology he otherwise used in his cosmology. There is diastema, things do not happen at the same time, but unfold and develop over time. This development occurs in a logical progression or necessary progression, akolothia, so that there will be some who are already nearing perfection, while others are only at the beginning of the way. Now, it's admittedly the case that Gregory, in the same context, does refer to differences of human volition, of prohairesis, as a reason why people are in different places on the road towards perfection. It is, I think, nevertheless absolutely striking how strongly he here too emphasizes divine agency by construing this history in strict analogy to the evolutionary unfolding of material creation from God's initial creative impulse. And there's a further complication. Once again, I can't develop that. In this context, he doesn't have to mention Christ. It's a first divine creation, second divine creation. And even though it's evident it's the redemptive process, he doesn't bring in Christ at all. And I think for those of us who think that Christ is absolutely central for his account, that seems to me a big problem, given that that's such a prominent text at the very climax of the series of homilies. But again, that's just by the by. The perspective Gregory assumes in this or presents in this passage, the first and second creation, seems to chime particularly well with his Christological texts in Homily 13, as they seem to integrate the Christ event into a salvific dispensation whose chief agent is the Logos. Assuming the first fruits of humanity, he becomes the head of a body, the community of those who permit themselves to be connected with him. This community is described as a new creation and thus ascribed in its existence to the activity, again, of God, of the Logos. And of course, once again, we could raise the problem of how Trinitarian is that or not. In this scheme, however, as we have noticed, it is difficult, almost impossible to discern what precisely Gregory has in mind when he speaks of first fruits and lump of dough. He does not dwell on any link between Christ's and our humanity to explain the progress of salvation from the head to the body, except for the most general and probably merely formulaic mention of our nature, quote unquote, have versus Hamon. Things are somewhat different in Gregory's exegesis of the Good Samaritan. There, the allusion to human nature as one unit seems more evident, and Gregory's allusion to first fruits and lump of dough therefore appears to carry more weight. Interestingly, however, we have seen that Gregory immediately adds to this with an emphasis on human need to act in correspondence with the divine gift. Overall, then, the passages in Gregory's commentary on the Song of Songs, in which he refers to Christ as the first fruits of the common lump of dough, offer two, not totally, but I think noticeably different perspectives on salvation. A theocentric one, in which agency in the process of redemption falls pretty one-sidedly to God, the divine Logos, and somehow the assumption probably is that human volition merges with that, and therefore doesn't become a problem. And a perspective that is somehow more on the receiving humanity, so we might say anthropocentric, but that's perhaps a misleading term here. And in this second perspective, Gregory puts side by side a description of humanity as the merely passive recipient of salvation, and at the same time an emphasis on the need for good works without evidence, as far as I can see, of a mediation between these two. The former of these two views is dominant in the homilies, I think, but the latter is a reminder how far Gregory here strays from the thought world familiar to those who study his earlier, more dogmatic writings. One indication of this distance, I think, is the overall marginal position the metaphor of first fruits and lump of dough occupies in his writing, the commentary on the Song of Songs. While he alludes to it as part of his stock soteriological imagery, he seems to have little use for it in the context of his present writing. Thank you.